watched my father-in-law's face go white. Not pale, white. The kind of white you see on someone who just realized the ground beneath them is gone. My mother-in-law gripped the edge of the table. Her wine glass stayed upright, but her knuckles didn't. Across from me, my wife had stopped breathing. I said it again, slower this time. In perfect Neapolitan Italian. Capisco ogni parola che avete detto stasera. I understand every word you've said tonight. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to a Sunday in March. My name is Garrett. Wait, no. I need to start somewhere that makes sense. My name is Stephen Merrill. I'm 51 years old. I work in commercial real estate in Charlotte, North Carolina. I coach youth baseball on Saturday mornings. I make a decent pot of chili. And until the Sunday 3 weeks before that dinner, I thought I had a solid marriage. 8 years with my wife, Renata. Her family had emigrated from Naples when she was 9. Her parents, Carmine and Lucia, had built a small empire running a chain of Italian specialty grocery stores across the southeast. The kind of places that actually imported the real stuff, not the jarred imitation nonsense. They were wealthy in the way that people who worked for everything are wealthy. You could feel it in every room of their house. Earned. Heavy. Theirs. I had always liked them, or tried to. Carmine was a big man with a handshake that meant something. Lucia was warm to Renata in a way that sometimes left no room for me. But I told myself that was just how it was. They were protective. She was their only daughter. What none of them knew, what Renata herself had never thought to ask, was that I'd spent nearly 5 years in Italy before we ever met. From 2008 to 2012, I worked as a project manager for an American development company that was building mixed-use properties on the Amalfi Coast. 5 years of site meetings and contractor negotiations and Sunday lunches with local families who barely spoke a word of English. I hadn't just picked up Italian. I'd earned it the hard way. In the dialects, in the rhythms, in the way Neapolitans drop the ends off words like they're in a hurry to get somewhere better. When Renata and I met at a colleague's birthday dinner in 2015, she mentioned her family was Italian within the first 10 minutes. I smiled and said that was great, that I loved the food. She laughed, and that was that. I don't know exactly why I didn't mention the 5 years. Maybe I was tired of it coming up in that particular way, where people immediately want to test you or perform for you. Maybe I liked the idea of knowing something privately. I'd been raised by a father who said the quietest person in the room is usually the most dangerous. Not in a threatening way, just in the sense that observers tend to understand more than talkers. So I kept it. A small, private thing. Just mine. Renata and I got married in 2016. I spent 8 years genuinely believing we were happy. Then came the Sunday in March when I came home early from a baseball practice that got rained out and found Renata in the kitchen on the phone speaking fast Italian. The kind of Italian you use when you're not performing for anyone. She was facing the window. She didn't hear me come in. I caught 2 sentences before she turned around and startled. Just 2. But they were enough. Lui non sa niente. Non ha mai saputo niente. He doesn't know anything. He never knew anything. She covered quickly, said she was talking to her cousin about a surprise party for Lucia's birthday. I smiled and said that sounded nice and asked what we were having for dinner. She relaxed. I didn't. I turned it over for 3 weeks. I'm not a man who jumps. I've built a career on patience, on watching a deal develop before I move on it. I told myself there were explanations, but at night I kept coming back to the way she'd said it. Lui non sa niente. The certainty in it. The ease. When the dinner invitation came, I said yes without hesitating. It was a Saturday in April, the kind that's still cool enough in Charlotte that you want a jacket in the evening. We drove to Carmine and Lucia's home in Ballantine, a house that could generously be called a compound, with a long driveway and a fountain that seemed unnecessary but felt right somehow, given everything else. There were cars I didn't recognize in the driveway. When I asked Renata who else was coming, she said just family. A cousin from Atlanta, another from New York. She didn't mention Antonio. Antonio was introduced to me as Renata's childhood friend from Naples who happened to be visiting the States on business. He was maybe 45, Slim, well-dressed in the way that comes from actual money rather than effort, he shook my hand and said it was a pleasure, his English lightly accented, his eyes assessing me in a way that felt clinical, like I was a property he was deciding whether to bid on. We sat down to dinner. 9 of us around a long table in the formal dining room, the kind of room that exists for occasions. I was placed at one end between Renata's aunt from Atlanta, a sharp-eyed woman named Fia, and a cousin named Tio who barely looked up from his phone. Renata was at the other end, beside Antonio, beside her father. The first 30 minutes were bilingual. Lucia would say something in Italian, someone would half-translate, the conversation would drift back to English for a while, then slip away again. I ate the antipasto. I complimented Lucia's mozzarella, which was genuinely extraordinary. I smiled at the right moments. I was very good at this. Years of dinner tables where I was the only American, the only one who looked like me, had made me good at the particular performance of pleasant ignorance. Then Carmine said something that made Lucia laugh and the table relaxed, and they stopped translating. I kept my face exactly where it was. Mild interest. Slight smile. Cutting my prosciutto. Carmine was talking about the stores, a new location they were considering in Raleigh. Antonio had apparently been involved in some capacity. Supply chain, sourcing. Something that put him in Renata's orbit more than I'd understood. Then Lucia said, still in Italian, "But when does she tell him? It's been long enough. He deserves to know, or he deserves to go." The table shifted slightly. Renata looked down at her plate. Carmine said, "She'll handle it when she's ready. She always does." Antonio said nothing, but he looked at Renata in a way that was not the way you look at a childhood friend. "He's not a bad man," Fia said in Italian, glancing in my general direction with a kind of tired sympathy. "That's what makes it sad." "No," Lucia agreed, "but sad doesn't change what's true." I reached for my water glass. Steady. I had spent 5 years learning to conduct myself at tables where I was being discussed as if I wasn't there. Italians are not always subtle. They are, however, sometimes overconfident about who speaks their language. Over the next hour, the picture assembled itself the way pictures do when you already know the shape of them and are just waiting for the details to fill in. Renata and Antonio had a history that hadn't ended when she moved to the States. It had continued quietly through visits that were framed as family business, through a trip to Naples 2 years ago that I'd been unable to join because of a closing I couldn't reschedule, through phone calls like the one I'd walked in on in March. Carmine knew, Lucia knew, Fia knew, the cousin Teo probably knew, based on the occasional glance he threw toward Renata. And then Lucia said the thing that changed everything. Still in Italian, still in that warm dinner party tone, as if she were discussing the wine. "The child will need to know his real father at some point. You can't hide something like that forever." I set my fork down. Not loudly, just set it down. My daughter, Emma, 4 years old, named after my own mother. Emma, who had my last name in my father's eyes according to everyone who'd ever met us together and who I'd been there for since the first ultrasound, since the middle of the night scares, since the first day of preschool when she'd held my hand in the parking lot so tightly I'd thought she might leave a mark. I breathed in through my nose, out through my mouth. I picked up my fork again. They kept talking about logistics, about timing, about how Stephen... They used my name, right there at the table, as if I were a piece of furniture. How Stephen was stable and provided well, and there was no reason to disrupt anything immediately, but at some point the arrangement had to become honest. The arrangement. 8 years of my life described as an arrangement. Lucia refilled Antonio's wine. She said something to him in a lower register, something about being patient, about the situation resolving itself by the end of the year. Antonio nodded slowly and looked across the table at Renata, and she finally looked back at him. And in that look was the entire answer to every question I hadn't known I was asking. I waited until there was a natural pause. Lucia had just finished a story about a supplier in Salerno, and everyone was laughing. The mood was easy and expansive, the way it gets when people feel safe. I looked at Lucia and said, in Italian, in the Neapolitan dialect she'd grown up speaking, "The mozzarella really is exceptional. You must have a good supplier, Or did you make it yourself this time? The laugh died. Lucia's mouth stayed open for a moment. Carmine turned to look at me very slowly, the way a large animal turns when it hears something unexpected. Theo went still. Theo finally put down his phone. Antonio's expression moved through several things quickly and settled on something careful and closed. Renato was looking at me the way you look at someone you realize you may never have actually known. I stayed relaxed. I refilled my own wine. I said, still in Italian, I lived in Italy for almost 5 years. Naples mostly, then the coast. I picked up the language. I apologize, I should have mentioned it sooner. Though it seems like the more important omissions tonight weren't mine. Carmine said, quietly, how long have you understood? Tonight? Since the Raleigh conversation. In general? I looked at Renata. Since March. Renata said my name. Just my name. I switched to English because I wanted her to have no option to misunderstand. I said, is Emma mine? Biologically, yes or no? The room was as quiet as rooms get. She said no. She said it so quietly it barely reached me across the table. But it reached me. And some part of me that had been running on adrenaline and sheer controlled will since March just stopped, like an engine that finishes exactly what it set out to do and then powers down. I stood up. I pushed my chair back and I thanked Lucia for the meal. Genuinely, because the food had been wonderful, and I'm not a man who abandons manners just because his life is ending. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. I looked at Antonio and I said, in English, whatever your intentions are regarding Emma, you'll be dealing with my attorney. I suggest you get one too. I walked out. I didn't slam the door. Slamming doors is for people who need the room to understand they're angry. I didn't need the room to understand anything. I just needed air and a parking lot and about 90 seconds alone before I had to figure out what to do next. I sat in my car for 20 minutes. Didn't drive. Just sat. The Ballantine fountain was lit up at the end of the driveway. Ridiculous and expensive, and somehow perfectly suited to everything I just learned about the people who'd built it. Emma was at home with a sitter. I thought about her face when I'd left that afternoon. She'd been in her pajamas, still showing me a drawing she'd done of a horse that looked like a rectangle with legs, explaining it with complete seriousness. I thought about that, and I let myself feel it for exactly as long as I could afford you in a parking lot. And then I started the car. I called my brother first. He's an attorney in Raleigh, not family law, but he knows people. I told him I needed a family lawyer first thing Monday, someone who was serious and had handled high-asset divorces. He asked if I was okay. I said I was driving. He said he'd call me back in 10 minutes with a name. Then I called the sitter and said I was on my way home, everything was fine, I'd be there in 25 minutes. Then I sat in the driveway of my own house for a while and just breathed. The lawyer my brother found me was a woman named Patricia Hollins, and she was exactly the kind of person you want in your corner when the other side has resources and motivation. She was small and unhurried, and she listened to the whole story without interrupting. And when I finished, she looked at her notes and said, "You're in better shape than you think." In North Carolina, she explained, I was on Emma's birth certificate. I had been the legally recognized father since the day she was born. I had been present, involved, consistent. The fact that I was not the biological father was significant, but not automatically disqualifying in a custody determination. Courts cared about the child. Courts cared about stability, continuity, emotional bonds. Emma called me Daddy. She had my name. She had never known anything else. What was not good, Patricia told me, was the potential for Renata's family to fund a prolonged legal fight and the possibility that Antonio might try to establish paternal rights. He was an Italian national. If he filed internationally, it could get complicated. We needed to move fast and establish my position clearly before anything else developed. I said, "What about the fraud?" She misrepresented paternity for the entire duration of our marriage. Patricia nodded. That's part of the divorce filing. It matters for terms. It matters for the court's view of her credibility. It doesn't automatically give you full custody, but combined with your established role as Emma's father, it builds a strong narrative. We filed the divorce papers on a Wednesday. Renata received them at the house, She had moved back in after the dinner because, I think, she didn't know what else to do, and I had moved to the guest room and we had circled each other quietly for a week like two people unsure of the geography. She held the papers for a long time. She didn't cry. She said, "I know you hate me." I said, "I don't hate you. I don't know what I feel. But I know what I have to do for Emma." She said, "She loves you." Like that was supposed to make any of this easier. Maybe it was. Maybe it just made it harder in a different way. The custody hearing was 6 weeks later. Carmine and Lucia had hired a lawyer who charged the kind of hourly rates that are meant to be intimidating. He presented Renata as a devoted mother, which she was, and argued that my lack of biological connection to Emma should be considered. He brought up Antonio carefully, framing him as someone who had a natural interest in his biological child's well-being. Patricia let him finish. Then she laid out 4 years of photographs. School pickups, pediatric appointments, the father-daughter dance at Emma's preschool where Emma had worn a yellow dress and fallen asleep against my shoulder in the car on the way home. She presented testimony from Emma's pediatrician, her preschool teacher, 2 neighbors. She presented the birth certificate, the continuous health insurance I'd maintained, the savings account in Emma's name I'd been contributing to since she was born. Then she brought up the phone records, Renata's calls to Antonio, the trip to Naples, the timeline that, laid carefully end to end, told its own story. She didn't need to editorialize, she just let it sit there in front of the judge. The judge was a woman in her early 60s with reading glasses on a chain and the manner of someone who had heard every version of this kind of story and was interested only in one question. She looked at both sides for a long moment. "Mr. Merrill," she said, "has functioned as this child's father in every meaningful sense since her birth. That is not a small thing in this court." She ordered primary custody to me with liberal visitation for Renata. Antonio's request to be recognized as Emma's biological father was acknowledged, but no custody or visitation rights were granted at that time. He would need to refile separately, and the court indicated it would consider Emma's age and established bonds heavily in any future proceedings. Renata wept in the hallway afterward. Her mother put an arm around her and said something in Italian. Something I caught but didn't respond to. Something about how this wasn't over. I walked past them without stopping. Not out of cruelty, just because I'd said everything I needed to say, and I was tired, and Patricia was already talking about next steps, and somewhere across town a 4-year-old was at daycare waiting for me to pick her up. The next year was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I've done some hard things. You don't understand what single parenthood costs until you're in it, not just the logistics, though those are brutal, but the weight of being someone's whole world in the evenings when you're also trying to remain a functional human being. I restructured my work schedule around school pickup. I learned which pasta Emma would eat and which she wouldn't, which nightlight setting didn't wake her at 2 a.m., which specific stuffed rabbit was non-negotiable for sleep. I made mistakes constantly and corrected them as fast as I could. Renata exercised her visitation inconsistently at first, the way people do when they're not sure how to inhabit the new shape of their life. She canceled more than she should have. Emma would ask for her sometimes in that careful way. Kids ask for things they're not sure they're allowed to want, and I would tell her the truth in the simplest version I could manage. Mama loves you very much, and families sometimes change shape, and that doesn't mean anyone loves her less. Antonio went back to Italy and did not refile. After about 8 months, Renata started showing up more reliably. We found an equilibrium that was cold but functional, and then less cold, and then just what it was. We were people who had built something together, and it had come apart, and we were both trying to do right by the person we'd built it for. That's the most honest way I can describe it. Carmine called me once, about a year in. Out of the blue, on a Tuesday afternoon. I almost didn't pick up. He said he wanted me to know that he had not handled things well. He didn't elaborate much. He wasn't built for elaborate apologies, but I could hear in his voice that he meant it, and I said I appreciated him calling, and that was that. Lucia, I haven't spoken to directly, maybe someday. I've been in therapy since the month after the dinner, which is something I resisted my whole life, and which turned out to be one of the better decisions I've ever made. You carry around a lot of things you don't realize you're carrying until someone points out that you've been walking with a limp. Emma is 5 now. She starts kindergarten in the fall. She is funny in that deadpan way small children sometimes are, completely unaware of it, which makes it twice as funny. She wants to be a veterinarian or possibly a baker depending on the day. She has her mother's eyes, and I'm told by people who knew my father's stubbornness, which she comes by honestly from at least one direction. I've started teaching her a little Italian, just words here and there. Colors, animals, the names of foods she likes. She thinks it's a game, which it is, but it's also something I want her to have. A thread back to a part of her story I'm not going to pretend doesn't exist. Whatever Antonio is or isn't to her will be for her to decide when she's old enough to decide it. What I can control is making sure she grows up knowing who she is, all of it, without shame. She asked me last week why people speak different languages. I told her because the world is big and people figured things out in different places at different times, so the words came out different. She thought about this and said, "But you can learn the other ones." I said, "Yes, you can." She said, "That seems smart." I said it was. I think about that dinner more than I'd like to. The specific quality of that silence after I spoke, the way it moved through the room like a temperature change, the way everyone's face became someone I recognized more clearly than I had before. There's a version of that night where I say nothing, where I go home and file away what I heard and try to decide what to do quietly on my own timeline. I understand why someone might do that. I understand the appeal of control, of patience, of choosing your moment carefully. But there's a 4-year-old who calls me Daddy, and I needed the record to be clear. I needed Carmine and Lucia to understand, right then, in that room, that I had not been asleep, that the quiet, agreeable son-in-law they'd sat across from for 8 years had understood every single word, not because I wanted the satisfaction of watching their faces change, though I'd be lying if I said that didn't count for something, but because the truth has a way of becoming load-bearing over time, and I needed mine to hold. So yeah, I speak Italian. It came in handy. I keep coming back to the fountain. That ridiculous, expensive fountain at the end of Carmine and Lucia's driveway, lit up in the dark while I sat in my car trying to figure out what was left of my life. There's something almost honest about it now. A thing built to impress, to signal permanence, to say we have arrived and we intend to stay. And underneath it, just pipes and recirculated water going nowhere. That's what I sat across from for 8 years without fully seeing it. I don't say that to be cruel to myself. I say it because I think there's something important in the gap between what we choose to see and what's actually there. I was a man who paid attention for a living. I read deals, read rooms, read people across negotiating tables. And I miss this, partly because I trusted someone I loved, partly because I wanted the life we'd built to be real, but also, if I'm honest, because I'd stopped asking questions I was afraid of the answers to. That's not stupidity. That's something closer to a choice we make when we're comfortable, and it costs more than we think. What I know now is that attention is a form of integrity. Showing up fully, not just physically, not just financially, but actually present and honest about what you're seeing. That's the foundation of everything. Carmine and Lucia built an empire. They had resources, connections, a lawyer who charged more per hour than most people make in a day. And they still lost, not because the legal system is perfect, but because the truth has a structural advantage over a lie. A lie requires maintenance. It requires everyone involved to keep performing. One person who stops performing, or one person who already knows, and the whole thing becomes load-bearing on nothing. Emma doesn't know any of this yet. She will, someday, in whatever version of the story she's old enough to hold. What I want her to understand, not from a speech I give her, but from watching how I've lived since that April dinner, is that the right thing and the hard thing are usually the same thing, and doing them anyway is not heroism. It's just what you owe the people who depend on you. I had every reason to walk away from a custody fight. I was not the biological father. The other side had more money and more motivation. Any reasonable person could have looked at the math and decided it wasn't worth it, but Emma called me Daddy, And she deserved someone who didn't make decisions based on what was easy. That took something I had to find on the floor of a Tim Hortons. Wait, no. A parking lot in Ballantyne, on the floor of a situation I hadn't chosen and couldn't undo. The will to stay in it, to be functional, to make the calls and file the papers and sit through the hearings without falling apart. That's not a quality I was born with. I think you build it, slowly, through smaller decisions. And then one night it's there when you need it. I'm teaching Emma Italian. A word here, a word there. She doesn't know why yet, but she will. And when I tell her the whole story someday, I hope what she hears isn't that her father was betrayed. I hope she hears that he paid attention, told the truth, and didn't quit. That's the version I want to leave her. The fountain is still there. I drove past it once about 6 months after everything settled. Still lit up, still going nowhere. But I was on my way to pick up my daughter from kindergarten orientation, and she'd saved me a drawing she'd done in class. A horse, or possibly a table, it was hard to say. And I had somewhere to be. That was enough.